Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're thrilled you can be here today. My name is John Levy, and I will be your host today. Our topic today is the 10 things you need to know about America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. This will be presented by my colleagues Jason Mercer, Craig Nowak, and our partner from the City of Great Falls, Michaela Schultz. They're going to be covering various elements associated with completing the Risk and Resiliency Assessments and Emergency Response Plans the AWIA requires, as well as walking you through the creation and the certification process. So before we get into the presentation, just a few housekeeping and introductory notes here. First, our first speaker, Jason Mercer, brings over 20 years of water and wastewater experience to his leadership role as water wastewater market group leader here at Morrison-Maierle. He has designed and managed projects throughout the Northwest and is focused full-time on providing water consulting services through his team here at Morrison-Maierle. Second, Craig Nowak is our senior water wastewater engineer at Morrison-Maierle. He's our Great Falls office manager. He was also recently honored with the 2019 America Waterworks Association Montana Section George Warren Fuller Award. Congrats to you, Craig. This is the highest award an engineer can receive in the field of water engineering. Very cool. And finally, Michaela Schultz is an engineer with the City of Great Falls Engineering Department. In this role, she has been involved with a variety of municipal infrastructure projects, all the way from planning and funding acquisition to design and construction administration. Michaela is currently managing several projects for the city, including the Water System Risk and Resiliency Assessment and the Emergency Response Plan. So logistics, first, if anyone has any questions during today's presentation, please submit them through the questions panel on your webinar interface. You'll see a little Q&A icon down there at the bottom of your screen. Tap that, type in your question, and we will answer as many as we can after the presentation concludes. We are also recording today's webinar, and we're going to be posting the recording to our website later this week. We'll also post the PowerPoint slides from the presentation if you'd like to access those as well. If you are an engineer seeking PDH credits, this session may meet requirements for PDHs depending on your professional registration and/or certification requirements. If you would like a certificate of participation to validate your experience, please email Lori Holteen at the email on your screen here, lholteen@m-m.net. Okay, so with that out of the way and without any further ado, I think I'm going to pass the mic over to Jason to start us in. So Jason, when you're ready, take us away.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for the introductions. Certainly glad to have participants with us today to spend the next hour learning about the America's Water Infrastructure Act and what we believe are 10 things you need to know about it. So there's a lot to discuss, so we're just going to dive in. So the first thing to know is that there are some hard deadlines associated with both the Risk and Resilience Assessment as well as the Emergency Response Plan. And those hard deadlines are based on the number of the population of the water system in which you serve. And so this chart breaks down the communities by size and lists the deadline dates. My guess is that most folks on the call probably fall into the last category, but I don't want to assume that. So we're going to put up our first poll question. And John, if you'd launch that, and if folks would just take a second or two to punch in an answer there. So we're just kind of curious, what is the population you serve with your water system if you are a water system provider? Just give it a few seconds here. And then John, if you can post the results. All right, great. Yeah, kind of what we were kind of thinking is that most would fall in that 10,000 to 3,300 category. So yeah, great that you're here with us and able to listen in. Hopefully we can provide some tips and tricks to make this process smooth. Since we all seem to work better towards a deadline, or maybe you need an incentive to get this complete, EPA has done that. They've added this kind of caveat that says, if you don't get it done by the date, there's a potential of a $25,000 fine by EPA. So failure to complete the certification of your assessment and emergency response plan by the required dates could subject your water system to the maximum fine. So just want to pay attention to those dates and make sure that you're not running risk of getting imposed on those fines. So the second thing to know is that time is a big factor in preparing your risk and resilience assessment and your emergency response plan. If you're starting from scratch or with limited data, the clock is ticking, and it may feel like you don't have enough time. Though we can't slow down time, hopefully through this webinar, we can help you manage your time and utilize the tools and resources available to you, which Craig will talk about here in just a few minutes, to really maximize your time. Often the lack of time is why many water systems look to folks outside of their organizations to help them prepare the RRA and ERP. Consultants like ourselves, state rural water organizations, or others can help with this process if you're feeling like you don't have enough time or your staff don't have enough time. With the next deadline approaching in June, now is the time to get started and make the decision on how you're going to approach getting these two important documents complete. The third thing to know is the difference between a vulnerability assessment versus a risk and resilience assessment. Following 9/11, the Bioterrorism Act of 2002 was passed by the federal government. It required water systems serving a population greater than 3,300 to complete a vulnerability assessment. The focus of the vulnerability assessment was on malevolent acts of terrorism or other intentional threats against critical water system components. For some on the call, you may be very familiar with the VA process and you may have completed one and have one. That is a good basis of information for you. But it's important to note that there is a difference between what you did under the vulnerability assessment and now what you need to do under the risk and resilience assessment. So what's the difference? Under the AWIA 2018, the risk and resilient assessments, or RRAs, must consider an all hazards approach. Like the vulnerability assessment, it needs to address malevolent acts of terrorism or other threats from bad actors. Plus, it needs to consider potential natural hazards in your evaluation, whether that be from floods, fire, wind events, anything naturally that could happen that could impact your water system. And then the third component of this risk and resilience assessment is cybersecurity. And cybersecurity recently has been in the news with that attack down on the water plant in Florida. And so this risk and resilience assessment really is emphasizing the importance of cybersecurity. And there is a tool available, again, which Craig will share and discuss with us that helps with that process. And so with the combination of these three things, you have that all hazards approach to evaluating the water system. This approach gives you, the water operator, the broadest picture of threats that may impact the operation of your water system and allows you the opportunity to prevent them to the best of your ability. One of the sources of information when completing the RRA is referenced as J100. And so J100 provides a reference threat listing. And so it defines it by malevolent threats as well as natural hazards. So this first slide we're looking at is dealing with categories that they consider malevolent threats. So each category is broken down into various levels of threats. And depending on your location, you may have very few to evaluate, or you might have quite a few to evaluate. And so what's interesting about this J100 document is just starting off, this list can feel quite overwhelming. But what we have found is that this tool prompts a conversation with the assessment team on what are the malevolent acts, or what are those natural threats that could happen to our water system. And so through that conversation, you're able to pare some of these down, eliminate some of them because they're just not really considered a threat to your water system. So again, this table, we see potential threats that might be carried out through vehicles. Insiders, that's a big component of the threat assessment, is looking at, oftentimes if someone wants to do sabotage, it's not from the outside, but it likely is from an inside disgruntled employee. And also then potential cyber attacks. As we move on to the bottom half of the chart, it's the natural disasters is what this one is considering. And so carefully considering where the threat is potential is the key, given your location. And so, for example, you know, for states in the Rocky Mountains, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, you know, looking at this list, you probably don't have to consider hurricanes. So you get to cross a whole category off if you're in one of those locations. But floods or wildfires, yeah, we definitely have to consider those in our threat evaluation as far as our water sources, as far as our pumping and systems that may be located in maybe timberland surrounding our communities. So something to note on this is the dependency or proximity threat. Dependency threats could be a single supplier of chemicals for our water plant. So if we're only reliant on one source for those chemicals, that could be seen as a threat. What happens if something happens to the manufacturer that supplies that chemical supplier and we're not able to get the chemicals we need? The other piece being our aging workforce or the proximity to industries of our key facilities, i.e. a refinery. So this all hazards approach really forces us to think about what threats might be lurking out there that could truly interrupt our delivery of water to our customers. And then it allows us to really dive into the probability of these threats occurring. So another goal of the all hazard approach is to get us thinking about the resilience of our water system. So the fourth thing to know is that what the term resilience means. So the term resilience, as it applies to water systems, is the ability of a community water system or an asset, like a pump station of a community water system, to adapt or withstand the effects of a malevolent or natural hazard without interruption. It also helps the system rapidly return to a normal operating condition if something should occur. So examples of resiliency could be, you know, we typically have emergency backup power to run a pump station. But if we had a water plant and we looked at, okay, what would be the emergency power required to run the water plant during a power outage so that we could keep producing water at the plant rather than just operating the high service pump station? That's kind of looking at how to be more resilient. Another example is a redundant source of water that is located in a different aquifer and not hydraulically connected to our primary source of water. So being able to withstand an attack or a natural hazard without interruption in the supply of water to your customers is ultimately the goal of the risk and resilience assessment. So with that, we'll launch our second poll question and kind of asking, where are you at in the process? Have you started it? You're working on it. Maybe you've hired a consultant to help you, or maybe you're not doing one and just wanted to learn more about them. If you could just indicate kind of where you're at in the process, that would be great. And then John, when you feel like you've got kind of a good representation, if you would post those results, that would be outstanding. All right, good. So majority of you are working on it. That's great. You know, kind of split between not doing one and then maybe not having started the RRA. So hopefully we can help you learn some more and get you kind of pushed in the right direction. So now I'll turn it over to Craig and he'll kind of walk through the tools.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Both the RRA and ERP can be prepared under various formats available on the web. However, today I'll be referencing two readily available formats, or they could be considered templates. The Risk and Resilience Assessment is prepared first, and for this, we have used EPA's VSAT, Vulnerability Self-Assessment Tool, which you can find on the web simply by typing in EPA VSAT. This is in a template form, but it is quite involved, and there is a learning curve with navigating the tool. However, there are instructions on the website that will help you. Generally, the procedure involves first identifying the utility system's assets, including the water source, treatment facilities, and components thereof, any pump stations, reservoirs, and the piping network. Next, the applicable threats are identified, as Jason already discussed, both malevolent threats and natural disasters. Threat asset pairs are then created by combining credible threats with critical assets. Here we see a preliminary screening matrix of threat assets pairs where consequences are estimated. There is consequence criteria provided on the website, so that can help you. Rankings are applied to each TA pair, with a 1 reflecting minimal concern to a 5 reflecting the highest concern. Those that are ranked 4 or 5, or perhaps you go to 3, 4, and 5, are then the basis for further assessment. The WEAT calculator, which is Water Health and an Economic Analysis tool, is then used to essentially quantify the consequences. This slide shows the risk summary of one threat asset pair. This example reflects a situation where an outsider gains access to the electrical source for a facility, be it the service entrance, disconnects, or transformers serving a treatment facility or a pump station. Starting at the bottom on this table, the likelihood of the threat occurring in any single year is 0.005, or that's 0.5%. The threat is the perpetrator gaining access to the electrical equipment. Moving up one line to the vulnerability likelihood, the likelihood that the culprit actually causes harm is 50% under the current situation, but only 6% if countermeasures or perhaps an alternate power supply in this situation is provided. The second line from the top, utility financial impact, shows the cost to make repairs should the perpetrator be successful. It's $35,000 under the baseline situation in this example. However, the cost to add countermeasures is shown as $425,000 and is shown under improvements. Factoring in the threat likelihood and the vulnerability likelihood results in the monetized risk for both situations, dollar figures which can be compared. In this case, the monetized risk to counter the threat is greater than the consequences of this threat being actually carried out. You'll see down there under fatalities and injuries that there are no injuries or fatalities associated with this TA pair. However, it is interesting to note that the tool does put a cost on an injury or a fatality. After the RRA is prepared, the emergency response plan is prepared. For this document, we have used the AWIA template, which is also available on the websites. There is an extensive amount of information that must be gathered and entered for the ERP. There is a learning curve with this document tool also, but it's not as complicated as the VSAT. Some of this information input includes system information, system assets, local services, such as medical facilities like a hospital or a clinic, grocery stores, ATMs, gas stations, hotels, etc. And you may wonder, why is this necessary for an ERP for a water system? Well, say you have an occurrence where you have 24 responders coming in to help you out. Well, they're going to live there for a week or 2 or 3 weeks, whatever the case may be, and they need to know where to go to get food, where the grocery stores are, if there's a medical situation where they can go to get treatment, ATMs for cash, and so forth. Other information is utility personnel, their roles and their contact information, as well as the same information for external partners, being their roles and contact information, such as fire, police, and hazmat responders. Also must enter information on critical customers, such as medical facilities, be it a hospital or a clinic, the bigger industrial facilities, commercial facilities, bulk users, which could be a neighboring water district or a neighboring town, or in the case of Great Falls itself, a military installation where we have Malmstrom Air Force Base next door to us and the city provides water to them. From there, emergency plans and procedures are outlined. If not already done so, you may already have these plans and procedures prepared, but some examples are what to do in the event of a physical or a cyber breach, a power loss to the treatment plant and or pump stations, and what to do if you have to do extensive sampling and testing out in the distribution system if it's just overwhelming for your lab. What other lab could you call in to help you with the sampling and testing? And then from there, the mitigation actions for the various situations are prepared. As Jason alluded to, cybersecurity is now really a big deal. You may be aware of the recent breach at the Oldham, Florida water treatment plant that Jason talked about, where a hacker gained entry to the control system and turned up the sodium hydroxide feed rate. And as far as I know, the culprit still hasn't been caught. And don't think something like this would be only a terrorist action. Like Jason said, a disgruntled employee or disgruntled former employee could certainly have easy access to the computer system and raise havoc. You should first practice cybersecurity with preparation of the RRA and the ERPs themselves. If you are preparing the documents yourself, limit the number of people who have access to the files and documents. And if you're having a consultant prepare the documents, ensure that they have access controls and also limit the number of people who can access the files. AWWA does offer a cybersecurity tool, which I'll be referencing here. And this piece provides for a systematic review of the policies and procedures and reports on the system's cyber resilience. Utilizing the cybersecurity tool is initiated by answering 22 yes/no questions, a couple of which are shown here. The answers to these questions are then entered into the tool, which is a spreadsheet. The answers then begin to populate successive tabs in the spreadsheet. The successive tab here asks for the status of over 85 control measures, whether they are fully implemented, partially implemented, planned, or that you feel that the corresponding risk is acceptable. The status of these control measures leads to another tab that outlines the number of project groupings which are recommended. And keep in mind that these projects may require a capital outlay, or they may be development of policies or programs, or just implementing existing policies and programs. Outcomes from the RRA can assist with development and updates to a utility's CIP. The RRA will identify system needs and will prioritize these needs based on the level of risk the utility is willing to take. Jason will elaborate a bit on how the RRA effort can be brought into this CIP process. It must be certified to the EPA that both the RRA and the ERP have been completed and certified by the dates that Jason has already showed us. The documents themselves are not to be submitted, only the certification is necessary. And certification can be provided by a couple of means. Here's an example of a certification letter or form. This would be completed and uploaded to the EPA site. The other option is to certify online by completing the online certification page. A couple more things about the certification process. First, if the utility is having a consultant prepare the RRA and the ERP, the utility must certify completion. The consultant is not to do so. And second, don't wait until the deadline date to become familiar with uploading the certification form or the online certification process. Access the site before the deadline to figure out the buttons to push and find the right pages on the website. Just a couple things to point out about updates to the Risk and Resilience Assessment and the Emergency Response Plan. They must be updated every 5 years at a minimum. And along with this, it is suggested that these documents be reviewed periodically. Don't just put them on a shelf or a file to be forgotten until the next due date arrives. And second, records must be maintained for at least 5 years. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michaela Schultz to offer her perspective from the utility's point of view on the preparation of these documents.
Thanks, Craig.
Michaela?
Oh, thanks, Craig. Hi, I'm Michaela. I'm with the City of Great Falls Engineering Division. I think the first thing that I'd like to do for you guys, seeing that most of the audience seems to be in that under 10,000 zone, is characterize our city specifically. So the City of Great Falls is a municipality with about 60,000 people. So those deadlines and those terms of completion applied to us. We actually currently have our RRA completed and we are in production of the ERP. So that's just to give you guys a kind of an idea of where we are as an owner in terms of our size and the process. I think one of the biggest considerations for us as a municipality was, do we do it ourselves or do we hire this out to a consultant? In our case, we ended up hiring out to a consultant, and I'll kind of walk you through the process of how and why we did that. I'll touch on 3 sections: self-evaluation period, collaboration, and reporting. Those are some of the considerations that we had when we went into this project. First of all, in terms of self-evaluation, the city of our size, we wanted to consider the amount of data that we had to get through. Craig spoke to some of the intricacies of these tools. You use the BSAT tool, the WEAT tool, and the AWIA template. These are all, federal tools that you need to apply to the process in order to get certified. So we wanted to take a look at our data and just see how much we had to crunch, just to give us an idea of, some sort of projection on the time it would take to complete this. In our size municipality, we had pump stations, water tanks, our water treatment plant, and obviously as part of our water treatment plant, we had our distribution system as well. In our municipality, the structure is thus that the water treatment plant is managed by a city employed individual. So although we had a lot of data to crunch through there and available there, we didn't have a large degree of separation between us and our water treatment plant manager. We do a lot of business with him hand in hand as a city. And so it was a little bit easier to get to that data. Whereas our wastewater treatment plant is a little bit different. That's managed by a separate entity, Veolia North America, which we contract under kind of a separate set of terms. So for us, it was kind of a no-brainer to at least get to the data, not only get to the data, but keep it secure. And then it was also just easy to coordinate with that water treatment plant manager. So that was one of the considerations we had. In addition to our water treatment plant, our distribution system is also managed by an in-house city employed utilities manager. So most of that data was readily available. We did include those 2 folks in a lot of the data acquisition that we did off the bat. We ended up meeting with Morrison-Maierle, our consultant, on site to collect a lot of this data and to go through those motions. So it does end up taking a little bit of time there. I've got that quantified here towards the end and I'll share that number. As far as our external stuff goes, A lot of that was handled in terms of communication. A lot of that was handled by Craig, and he ended up reaching out to some of those entities to fill in that sort of data into these templates. I would say that probably the most important thing to consider from my perspective during this process is just the structure that you have municipally and the amount of data that you have. You want to make sure that those large amounts of data are getting entered in correctly, and so that you're producing a document that is then viable, not only for use, but also for certification. It ended up being that we spent about 90 hours, and that's a total in-house amount. That's my time and a number of my supervisors' time in data acquisition, collection, and kind of responding to Craig. So that hopefully will give you a little bit of an idea, so you can scale to your municipality. I guess the last section on there is the reporting. We already have the WEAT documentation, and we were certified here in December for our Risk and Resilience Assessment Plan. So we have all of that data now in-house, and that's going to help us, I think, in the future planning. Obviously, some of our capital improvements, we're now fully aware of the areas in which we may or may not fall short per federal standard in terms of protection of our systems. This sort of stuff is just going to make it much easier to prove to any sort of public commission or any sort of funding source, what we need in terms of our planning into the future, in terms of our CIP projects too. We're also undergoing a few leadership transitions over here at the City of Great Falls. And I find that to have a document like this that's fairly simplified, that includes all of the contacts and all of the information from this large amount of data, is going to be a very helpful document to have throughout those transitions to ensure that the safety of the infrastructure is maintained throughout all of that transition. Now I'll turn it over back over to Craig, and he can talk a little bit more about the stakeholder input from his end.
Okay, thank you, Michaela. Again, the RRA and the ERP are planning documents. Therefore, input and guidance are necessary from the utility staff, especially if a consultant is preparing them. Emergency responders must also weigh in and provide input when the documents are being prepared. They'll provide perspectives that you may not think of or be aware of when thinking through emergency responses. And finally, as Michaela alluded to, utility managers, decision makers, and elected leadership must be supportive and certainly aware of the process. They are the ones who will provide the resources necessary to implement programs, policies, and the funding. And as I turn this over to Jason, I believe we have another poll question here.
Yeah, so our final poll question is just what concerns you most about completing the AWIA requirements? No concerns, don't know where or how to get started, unsure about having enough time, worried about the consequences of not completing, or other. So we'll just give it a second there. And then John, when you're ready, you can launch the results for us. Yeah, 50% of you unsure about having enough time, and I think that's good and interesting that you recognize that, and certainly with the tools that are available and being able to maximize your time will be important. So the last couple things we want to touch on and just kind of closing out is kind of coming back to this capital improvements. What's interesting is out of the RRA, it'll generate a list of capital improvements for you to complete, either near term or long term, in order to improve the resiliency of your system. And I think what we've taken from this is that this document and kind of this focus on resiliency and these capital improvements can really help you educate decision makers. Knowing councils have turnover, new mayors, new councils. Sometimes they look at the amount of money that's being spent on a water utility with infrastructure improvements, with piping improvements, plant improvements, and they kind of question, what are we getting out of this? And I think through the capital improvement plan that you will be able to land on with your RRA, it gives you a tool to really sit down and educate those decision makers on the projects that you have identified and the value those projects bring to protecting the utility and the customers of the water system. And so really emphasizing, that capital improvements plan, the documentation, the data, and Michaela touched on this, the information you have really gives you the opportunity to sit down with those decision makers and inform them of the importance of the water system. The last thing we wanted to touch on was maybe some future funding opportunities. It's interesting, FEMA used to have a program called the Pre-Disaster Mitigation, and it would give out monies to communities to deal with natural hazards and it was really kind of focused on flood improvements. And FEMA has morphed that program into a new program called BRIC. And what that stands for is Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities. And so it seems that to us that a benefit of completing an RRA is that it could set up communities to submit and potentially get funding from this program. If you think about our all hazards approach, we looked at malevolent acts, but we also looked at natural hazards. And so with FEMA focusing on resiliency and those things that are kind of going towards natural hazards, this is a program that I would encourage everyone to get familiar with and to learn more about it. It's really on kind of the infant stage of development. But what's interesting is that the funding of this program is based on taking 10% of declared disasters for your state and applying those funds into a pool that can be then set up for helping communities and kind of building resiliency into their system, addressing some of the natural hazards that you've identified in your RRA. And so that it kind of helps you get those things in place before disaster strikes. So really an interesting program, something I would highly encourage everyone to take a look at, get familiar with, and kind of see if there is a road or an avenue as you have developed your RRA that maybe some of those capital improvement plans could be funded with. So in closing, just wanted to wrap on the 10 things you need to know. Here's the bullet list of what we've discussed, from schedule, tools, cybersecurity, stakeholder input, updates, and then that all important deadline. So with that, I think we're ready to open it up for questions. And what do you have for us, John?
Well, first of all, Jason, Craig, Michaela, thank you for a great presentation. Well done. I think there are just a couple questions from my side of things. And the first would be, talk more about the VSAT model. Craig, you mentioned it's kind of a process. How long does it take? What goes into that? What's the level of effort we're going to need to complete that VSAT model?
The first, I just want to point out, the first thing that's got to be done is open up that tool and become familiar with it. And like I said before, navigate that. There are some little nuances on the icons to push and figure that out. But once that's figured out, for this one that we did it for the city of Great Falls, and granted this is a larger water system, it was probably about 80 hours of just VSAT stuff, for lack of better terms, getting the information in there. There's some subjective things that have to be thought through and figured out to put in there. Costs for different disasters, if you will. And that also included some back and forth with Michaela and her staff over there. I had questions for them, items for them to review and push me one way or the other. I had my thoughts. I lived here long enough. I know quite a bit about the system, and I had my thoughts, but I wanted Michaela to tell me more of what to do there. So I guess really to answer your question, I'm going to say 2 weeks, about 80 hours. but that is spread out over several weeks.
Okay, so it's definitely something you want to put the time into, and that's a good segue to the next question, which is, Craig, you were just sort of alluding to, well, it took us roughly 80 hours for Great Falls, but to what degree should smaller communities expect a difference, whether it's putting the VSAT tool together or any of the components of the ERP or the RRA? Are there noticeable differences in terms of time, effort, resource needs that smaller communities are going to need to prepare for versus larger communities? That's a question for any one of you three.
I'll first jump in on that. This is Craig again. Yeah, there would be less, because with the city of Great Falls, they've got how many reservoirs and quite a large treatment plant and numerous pump stations. We went and visited each one, and not just visited and looked at them, but looked at them with an eye towards vulnerability, if you will. So that's a factor there. And then just with all of those facilities, pump stations, reservoirs, and the water treatment plant, more threats come into play. So there were more threat asset pairs that had to be evaluated. I'm reluctant to quantify how much less, but it would be less. That's for sure.
Thanks, Craig. Michaela, Jason, any other additions to that?
I think that covered it pretty well, Craig. I mean, the size, just getting through all of our infrastructure was quite a process, just because of the size of the city and the number of elements that we had. And it did take a couple days to even just do the visits. So if you got a smaller municipality, that could be much less time. I think there was several folks involved in that too. We had the time of the water treatment plant manager, the time of the utilities manager, and a couple engineering entities. So it was, I think, a fairly expensive and time consuming endeavor overall, just to visit all of the infrastructure. I think that would scale back quite a bit depending on your size and structure.
Another factor that comes into play there is how much information is readily available. And that can be extensive, but this water reservoir, when was it built? What's the capacity of it? Pump stations, what's the capacity of the pumps? How many pumps? Do you have a generator? How big is that generator? So on and so forth. When you multiply that times half a dozen tanks or pump stations, then it becomes extensive. And of course, that plays out into a water treatment plant when you have the different processes there. And the source water, depends on what the source water is.
I think, John, what I might add is that, for those water systems that did a vulnerability assessment or have that, that's a great document to kind of start from, because some of the threats that you've identified in that planning you did back in 2002 or 2003, really gets built on and built upon for the risk and resilience assessment. So I wouldn't forget that document and using that to start with. The other thing I would say is just spending time looking at that J100, the threats that are there, and really asking yourself and your assessment team, could this happen? And, you kind of want to always err on maybe the side of being conservative and say, yeah, it could happen. So you want to consider it. But there are some things for smaller systems, I think, that you can really start to kind of scale that threat asset pair down in that list, so that it doesn't quite feel so overwhelming as you start to plug that information into the VSAT model.
Great points. Thank you all there. I think we've got just one last question, and this is for Michaela, and it's just asking you, talk more about your involvement from the city side of things. What was your involvement in sort of the process, and did this take, a significant amount of your time, or were there things that you were sort of outsourcing to your consultant and others, and you're just sort of estimating your effort, the amount of resource you put into this compared to other partners for the ERP and the RRA?
Oh, it's a good question. So I'm part of, the machine, I guess, and my role is kind of the project engineer in oversight. And it was primarily a role of coordination. I was coordinating with Craig. He would essentially come to me with whatever the needs of the tool were, whatever we needed to input, whatever he needed to collect per the directive of the tools. He would basically, turn into me questions, and I would move those questions to the correct audiences, whether that was somebody involved with distribution, and we kind of kept an eye on the team that we involved. But as far as this city specifically, I was involved, the water treatment plant manager was involved, the utilities manager was involved. In terms of actually soliciting the consultant and engaging them and signing them up and making plans to actually complete the plan, that was our public works director. So I think he sat down and did very much what you guys are doing now, and just realized the size and scope of our system, and at which point we decided to hire the consultant so I could have more of a coordination role as opposed to operating these tools and different things. So I could keep on track of the other capital improvement projects that I was designing and managing. So he realized this was a timely thing, and we didn't necessarily have the time available in the office in terms of my time. So I'm just kind of, a baseline engineer. I'm focused very heavily on production, distribution, design of some more small capital projects. So this ended up being a good role for me to just coordinate. So because I had that internal knowledge of where things were kept, who was doing what, I could coordinate with Craig and get data to him. I think a large part of that coordination was meetings as well. We would basically organize all of this data, and then we would meet to review it for basically, to pass it, to certify it that that we were getting an accurate representation of the data that we were inputting into this tool. So I think that was fairly time consuming. As far as the coordination with Craig goes, it was pretty clean, pretty clear and cut. But the large bulk of my time was spent attending those various meetings where we were defining the system and evaluating the system, like I spoke to earlier, and then reviewing the data that we were actually inputting into these tools so that our public works director was comfortable certifying those. And so I hope that answers the question. Let me know if there's any additional.
Yeah, no, I think it does. Thank you. And it definitely seems to be the case that, larger city or smaller, there's going to be some involvement from local staff. So.
John?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is Craig again. Michaela touched on something that I briefly talked about on one of my slides there. I just want to emphasize, don't talk to a whole bunch of people about this, about the details. It's a security issue. It's a security issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, people can be aware, and of course, upper management, elected officials have to be aware that it's happening, but don't talk details. We don't want everybody to know the vulnerabilities of a system.
Absolutely.
Great point. Great point. Okay. Well, I'm seeing that's the last question. So I'm going to go ahead and close things up here. I just want to let people know that we have a couple additional blog posts on our website, m-m.net, that provides a bit more details and information about the AWIA, including the blog post that led to this webinar, 10 things you need to know. As we do close down, I just want to remind everyone that we are going to be posting the PowerPoint slides and a recording of this webinar on our website. Again, that is m-m.net. If you are an engineer seeking PDH credits, this session may meet requirements for PDHs depending on your professional registration and or certification requirements. Please email lholteen@m-m.net to request a certification certificate rather. Finally, we'd love to hear from you. If you have questions or like to stay in touch, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us, social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social sites. Connect with Michaela, Craig, and Jason on LinkedIn. They'd love to hear from you. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close the webinar down. Thank you so much for participating, and we will see you on the next one.